So, warm welcome back to Andy Worthington. And we started talking, as I suppose it is hopeful by that particular administration, if we're going to call it that, about the latest antics, as one of the Republican GOP lawmakers said this week, of the Orangery, amongst which is the detainment of some ICE removees, if that's the correct term, in Guantanamo, a site about which you've been indefatigably campaigning for years now, with not a little success as well. But what do you make of this particular twist in the tale?
Okay, well, so one of the key elements of Trump's new administration is a war on migrants, a war on undocumented migrants in the United States. And, you know, he has at various times expressed, his intention to remove 13.3 million people from the United States who are undocumented migrants. The amount of money that would cost is so eye-watering that it almost beggars belief. We are talking about hundreds of billions for a process of removing people who play a part in the United States economy at all kinds of levels.
Some of whom may have legal redress.
There is that, but I mean, I think essentially it's a part of an immigration process, that because immigration is a kind of flawed process in the fact that especially as the decades have gone on, no one wants to open the doors because they will be literally flooded with more people than they can handle. So we've ended up in an uneasy situation whereby our reliance, Western countries' reliance on workers who will do jobs that nobody wants, who will be paid less than citizens would want for doing jobs, has come up against increasingly opposition to any immigration whatsoever. We know that here in the UK with Brexit. And what we're seeing in the United States is some of those Brexit follies being rewritten in a very large scale by Donald Trump. So migrants in the US do all kinds of jobs that people don't want to do. They work in factories, they work in fruit picking, they work in care. The stories that are all actually familiar from the UK, if people can be bothered to look at who's doing what jobs and why.
They get their hands dirty.
Yeah, they get their hands dirty and they don't get paid brilliantly.
Yeah.
It's hard. There are all manner of ways to get into the United States. There are asylum procedures that are in place.
A friend of mine in Chicago was saying, she's from London, it takes years.
Right.
She's only recently, I think after some 6 or 7 years, finally completed the last tranche of this.
Right, well, exactly.
Yes.
But, but that's how workers get into the United States to do the work that nobody else wants to do. Donald Trump, one of the first things he's done is he's attempted to completely shut down any asylum claims on the southern border whatsoever, because he's pretending that there's an actual war going on there, and he's declared a national emergency. But there are millions of undocumented migrants in the United States who are people who, having to do that because of the difficulty of getting into the country legally,
doesn't stop
are
them
then
having
working,
kids having school places and being able to hold down jobs. They're
they're working,
in the process.
they're paying taxes,
and
they're trying to go through a process that will then enable them to be recognised as people who have the right to stay in the United States
and vote.
Yeah, well, yes. And so, so Trump's essentially just with a huge hammer come down on every undocumented migrant living in the United States, portraying them through this vile racist propaganda that he's putting out, that they're all gang members and murderers and absolutely hysterical and desperately racist and horrendous. And so as this is happening, he's obviously got to find a way to get rid of these people. One of the things that he's been doing is that there's a process that began in the 1990s called expedited removal. What this is where it applied to until Trump came in was that if you were detained within 100 miles of one of the United States borders, and if you hadn't been in the country for more than 2 years, you could be summarily deported. Without any legal rights whatsoever. Now that's a very dodgy grey area. It literally means you could be walking down the street, picked up by immigration agents. They say, "Who are you? What right do you have to be here?" You can't prove anything, and they just put you on a plane and send you back home. You don't get to see a lawyer. You don't get to engage with any of the legal processes involving immigration.
And presumably the invocation of this originally under what Clinton, some of that sort of era, would have been where there were reasonable grounds to suspect somebody of what would now be termed terrorism or malfeasance of some kind.
Well, there's elements to it that have involved people being accused of crimes, not necessarily convicted of them. I'm not entirely sure how it worked in the 1990s. I mean, the problem with all of these policies when they're implemented is they're a response to a requirement that people perceive to remove unwanted migrants. So the basis of it can often be just very blunt. It's just like, we need to reduce numbers.
Bit of a sidebar, Andy, but I'm just wondering if there is some sort of justification for some level of legislation where there are, in quotes, to use an English law term, reasonable grounds, and where you're dealing with organised crime, V-Day, drug trafficking, people trafficking, that sort of thing, which is often what's wheeled out, isn't it? By the right as well as the left.
No, those exist. I mean, putting aside the expedited removal problem, because that doesn't allow you to talk to anyone to challenge the basis of your removal, which is a dangerous area for the law. Trump has now expanded that to the whole of the United States, not within 100 miles of the border. Which is why people across cities in the United States are now cowering under the fear that they will be picked up by an immigration agent and put on a plane without being able to challenge that happening. But beyond expedited removal, if that's not going to happen to you, then you engage with the immigration process. You can get a lawyer. You can challenge the basis of your of the government's efforts to get rid of you. Noticeably, crimes are involved in the process of removal under Trump.
Trespass, for one, presumably.
Well, shoplifting, but I mean,
That's
that's pretty extreme. If you steal a can of beans and then you get deported from the country. The problem is that you don't have to be convicted.
Yes,
you only have to be charged.
It's a box being ticked, isn't it? Particularly if you don't provide the equivalent of food banks or a safe harbour as Chicago does, for example. Incidentally, my friend in Chicago points out that Chicago is more or less bankrupt, and that's the case that Republicans there are making for the fact that we've just taken on too much.
Right.
Anyway, I'll just throw that in. But anyway.
But I mean, the thing that struck me about that you don't have to be convicted, you only have to be charged, is that's an invitation for corrupt police to charge people. Maybe they're filling a quota of how many undocumented migrants must be removed. A conviction is one thing, absolutely, certainly, and and that's what Trump's kind of been pushing the most. The violent criminal aspect of the story. And so what he suddenly surprised everyone with last week was the announcement that he was going to be sending some of the most dangerous of these alleged people to Guantanamo Bay.
The fun-filled pleasure dome of the Occidentals. Yeah.
Well, exactly. So, and Guantanamo Bay is a naval base, a sprawling naval base in Cuba, which the United States has had for over 100 years. It's notoriously the location of the War on Terror prison, military prison for the poor men and boys seized in the War on Terror, who have been held there, largely without rights for up to 23 years. what Guantanamo also has is a migrant operations center. This was first set up in 1991 for intercepting would-be migrants to the United States at sea who were coming from either Haiti or Cuba, to stop them landing on US soil and claiming asylum. The George W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, came up with this idea that if they intercepted them and held them at Guantanamo and processed them, they could avoid this. It was a bit of a scandal at the time in the 90s because at one point there were 25,000 people held there. That was the highest number. But it was a sprawling tent city that kind of almost overwhelmed the naval base, and where it was extremely difficult to provide decent, humane living standards for the people that they were holding.
Which originally might have been the aim.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to do anything at Guantanamo because you have to fly everything out there.
Yeah.
You have to fly personnel out there to run every aspect of everything. You have to fly food and drink out there. It's logistically complicated.
Mission creep and all that.
By, I think about 96, the numbers of people held in the Migrant Operations Centre had dropped. It's continued in use ever since, but only holding dozens of people every year. So they're still intercepting small numbers of people at sea, and they've been taking them to Guantanamo. Well, Trump has taken both Guantanamo, the war on terror prison, which you remember he wanted to fill up with bad dudes the first time he became president, and didn't manage to do, because everybody advised him that Guantanamo...
Well, ended up hiring a few of them, didn't he, I suppose?
But he's put that together with the Migrant Operations Centre, and he's gone, this is a great way of dealing with my migrant problem. And he's also obviously thought it's going to grab headlines, it's going to show me as the tough guy that I am.
Yeah, and presumably, other things that might be going on that would have even more import will be pushed to the side.
Yeah.
The back pages,
And so, just a few days ago, a plane of migrants, Venezuelan gang members apparently, was flown to Guantanamo. Now, the presumption was that they would be held in the Migrant Operations Centre. But no, the Department of Homeland Security announced that actually they've been put into one of the cell blocks of the Guantanamo Bay prison, the prison for the War on Terror prison. And the huge fundamental problem here, Andy, is that the prison is run by the military, the US military, not the Department of Homeland Security that runs the Migrant Operations Centre. Crucially, the only people that are allowed to be held in the War on Terror prison are people that have been captured in connection with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or associated forces that are allegedly involved in the 9/11 attacks.
And subject to military justice.
Subject to military justice. And military jurisdiction. That it's not a flexible arrangement whereby you can add on people that you want to be detained there. So Trump has very fundamentally broken the law by moving these Venezuelan migrants into an actual war on terror block in the Guantanamo prison. And there will be legal challenges. And I don't think that there's any way that he can prevail against these legal challenges.
I suppose the equivocation is this idea of Homeland Security, which in its first tranche seemed to talk a lot about surveillance and the enemy within in that sort of post-Thatcherite way. So the revival of, as you say, the revival of that has important legal implications because of how that's panned out and how the consensus settled down for a bit.
Well, it's sweepingly racist, isn't it? The entire basis of designating one huge group of people as a threat, which he's done, and where he's trying to actually. One of the ways he's trying to sidestep the law is by suggesting that the United States is at war with an invasion on its southern border, which is clearly not the case.
Yeah.
But if he can get away with seizing wartime powers for how he deals with it, then he's got much more leeway for avoiding accountability and avoiding too much complications with Congress.
Is there a link here, perhaps, with the fact that he, in his early speeches, he was demonising the FBI, and he's recently, I think, evicted a senior female officer with responsibilities within the Pentagon, presumably, although we've no confirmation of this, I think, that she wasn't going to go along with the premise of his explicitly racist golden age.
Right, yeah. And I think she's challenging that because, of course, he thinks he has the right to do whatever he wants, but he doesn't. He's constrained by the law. You can't randomly get rid of people that you don't like. There is a process that you have to go through. But he's trampling over everything.
Back with Andy Worthington, I got an email this morning from one Roger Hallam of Extinction Rebellion, who's in Choky at the moment. It got us thinking, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Roger is able to talk to the world from his prison cell is the only glimmer of light in the situation that he faces, because Roger is one of the environmental protesters who was given these extraordinary prison sentences for organising the roadblock on the M25. 5 years for a 20-minute speech, he said. Yeah. I mean, he was just asked to take part in a Zoom conversation that the other activists were happening, and he got a 5-year sentence, if I'm right, and the others got 4-year sentences, which are punitive beyond belief. I mean, no one is imprisoning environmental protesters for anything like this amount of time, and that's as a result of the punitive laws that were implemented under the last Tory government, and which have not been repealed by the
Priti Patel business.
Yeah, by the Labour government, Priti Patel and Suella Braverman. Yes. I mean, it's funny. Yeah. Time passes and you forget how dreadful it was when these things were actually happening. But the impact of them has stayed with us. Environmental protesters can step out into the road with the intention of slowing down traffic. That's all. Mild disruption to highlight the biggest existential threat that humanity has ever faced.
Might accidentally do.
And they can be arrested. Yes. I mean, they can be arrested within seconds of doing that, and end up in prison. Yeah. So Roger is deprived of his liberty, but is still trying to speak to the world from his prison cell, to still try and mobilise people to understand the severity of the crisis that we're facing, and to begin to get together and to mobilise and to do what we can to resist it. It would be doubly alarming if environmental protesters were being silenced. So it's great that he's able to speak to the world, but it's interesting because I met up with some environmental protesters just before Christmas, and who had been speaking to one of the protesters who's also in prison, who had thrown the famous throwing paint on the glass protecting the Van Gogh painting. Yeah. And actually, what I think, where it becomes philosophically very interesting is that although these people are imprisoned and have completely lost their liberty, their minds are still free, and that's what I think becomes much more noticeable about what's happening, is that it's the freedom of their minds that is the most crucial thing, not the imprisonment of their bodies, because what they're actually trying to tell us is we're all in a prison where we're killing ourselves. The entire planet is a madhouse. And so depriving them of their liberty, to kind of flip that into saying, actually, you are thinking this is the worst thing of all. But the worst thing of all is that people aren't paying attention. And the main thing is they haven't been able to change our minds. We're still here and we're still telling you.
So Hallam makes the link between fascism and climate change. Musk is talking about sending X number of people to Mars as a way of resolving that somehow or other. Is this, in your view, the front line in terms of where Hallam is coming from? Is this where essentially we have to put the checks and balances in place?
What, in terms of climate collapse?
Yeah.
Well, climate collapse is either overtly or in an unacknowledged way, I think the driver of so much that's happening in the world. I think there's a derangement amongst the political class who can't accept that everything that they have been promoting for the last 40 years,
business as usual,
neoliberalism, and let's look around. People are having a better time than they've ever had. We're so successful. We're so clever. But actually, all of that, which is all based around overconsumption, has literally been killing us quicker than anything since the start of the industrial era, where we started killing ourselves then.
Yeah.
The impact of that has taken decades or over a century to fully impact. In the sense that it wasn't really until the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, particularly that science experts started to notice that what we were doing was having an impact. And I mean, it's quite extraordinary the extent to which that has been ignored. If you consider that it's nearly 40 years since Hansen did his speech to the Senate, where he laid it all out, the direction that we're going. So I think there's a derangement amongst the political class that they can't accept this, and almost like some kind of primal resurgence of something very dark in humanity. They've gone for destruction instead, and I think if you see it through that prism, that's why they leapt on the whole Russia situation of here's a bogeyman, here's a man we can portray as the very definition of evil on the face of the earth, and we can just get into war again.
Has to be said, he rather played up with the pantomime villain image, didn't he? But yeah, sure.
And I think that's also behind partly, maybe largely, what's been behind the absolute failure over 15 months of genocide for Western leaders to show the necessary horror at what's happening, which honestly, if we look back through political leaders before, I mean, I'm trying to imagine John Major breezily approving Israel's genocide. I just don't think it would have happened. I think the political class at that time was much more aware of nuances of global politics, was much more aware of the importance of human rights and humanitarian law. I don't mean that they didn't flout them, but I don't believe that there was the kind of blanket denial of any extent of horrors that should be stopped that we saw for the 15 months of the active genocide.
Nothing else. It's optics. I mean, Major is a product, as it were, the one nation working class tendency from Brixton. But he never quite lost touch with his roots, did he? Wherever he decided to plant them. So you and we were saying earlier on with Tyler that someone like Starmer doesn't really go. His security detail won't let him, or he won't let himself venture further than 5 feet outside his front door.
Yeah. Well, I mean, an
awful lot is happening.
Well, he's not interested. I mean, the problem of neoliberalism within the Labour Party. So I mean, Starmer and the people that are close to him are most. Their biggest reference point is the Tony Blair years.
Yep.
But it's way worse than it was then, and it's partly, I think, because of what they had to do to achieve power. So, first of all, they had to turn on Jeremy Corbyn, who, by no means was as extreme and on the left as people are suggesting. He's really, a kind of centre-left figure, and the redistributive aspects of his economic policy, which John McDonnell was trying to push by getting left-wing economists from around the world to propose different ways of doing things. It's not that radical, but it is that radical if you're wedded to neoliberalism. And so their mission to erase him, destroy him, which led to a witch hunt against the left in the Labour Party, has created this.
Already been resolved.
It's created this horrible authoritarian, paranoid party, which I think is what they are in government. And because of their obsession with neoliberalism and not letting it go, and thinking that, that after all this time and all this failure, that only massive private corporations have the capacity to deliver the change that we need. I think their contempt for ordinary British people is just almost beyond imagining. And they're failing, aren't they? They're becoming more unpopular every day.
Well, I suppose one of the common denominators, which you pointed out off mic yesterday, for example, is Starmer's interesting relationship with BlackRock. I think George Osborne was a key player in them before he got into politics, wasn't he? And the fact that a lot of our infrastructure, you mentioned Freeport yesterday, has effectively gone covertly into these private hands. Over in Gaza, Trump is talking about developing a sort of Butlins, as far as I can make out, and again, it's real estate, isn't it?
It's interesting the notion that of Donald Trump imagining it as a Butlins.
Dreams of Ilfracombe, is he not? I suppose yes. Anyway.
No, I suppose what we're into in so many ways is that although the privatization mania has logically exhausted itself in that. It's taken over far too much that should have been in public hands. It's still the dominant philosophy. So all that there is left is how can we arrange even more for private capital to take over the state. And the alarming thing really about BlackRock, I think, is that, the trillions that BlackRock has in its portfolio, globally, they're such a menace to humanity as a whole because so much of it is based around property. In the BlackRock mentality, putting aside private ownership. So, if you're an owner-occupier in this country, you're in a different territory than if you're not.
And there are very increasingly few of them, aren't there?
If you're a renter,
yes,
you have really no protections against predatory capitalist behaviour. And that's been going on, obviously, particularly since the start of the Blair years. There's no restraint on the behaviour of private landlords, and there's no protection for people who primarily need affordable housing and cannot get genuinely affordable housing. So BlackRock is a giant investor swooping around cities around the world, trying to buy up as much property as it can, because the returns that they can make, by enslaving individuals in overpriced private rented property is immense. And that can only be really, that's part of the picture of what Keir Starmer's done. He said, look, we've got no money because we won't think outside the box. We're not going to tax the super rich. We're not going to be a Labour Party that believes in redistribution, which they should do. So they're powerless. They're powerless and they're prostrating themselves before whoever's got big money and saying, help us out, you can do whatever you want. And that's just massively dangerous. The whole Freeport thing...
Ben Hootcham was the guy in Teesside, wasn't he? I think one of the
prime
movers of that. Yeah.
But that's establishing vast areas of the country that will no longer be run by democratic control, by councils. It will be private companies that run the places that people live. Well, I mean, if you're an enthusiast for that, then I think you're not really paying attention.
You might see a roundabout sponsored by florists. But this is that, as you say, that's with the amp turned up to 11, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what does that do, effectively? I mean, I think that's such a striking and pertinent analogy to these Gazas living on the rubble of their old homes, because effectively Trump might come along and say, right, this is ours now, you're not paying rent, off you go.
No, well, I mean, Trump is such an absurd figure, and actually, his pronouncements on Tuesday about Gaza, about, its complete ethnic cleansing or forced displacement, as that would be. And then, out of the blue, his notion that actually the US was going to take it over and redevelop it as the Riviera of the Middle East it's not going to happen. The contraventions of international law that are involved in the forced displacement of an entire population are almost beyond imagining.
Notwithstanding the BlackRock influence, there are at the moment red lines that can't be crossed.
Yeah, I think it's a red line that can't be crossed. I think Trump has united the world in a way that we haven't seen since before October the 7th, if ever, in support of the Palestinians' right not to be ethnically cleansed from their own land. Immediately, straight after the Saudis, who were very crucial to Trump, because he wants them to agree to a normalization process with Israel, to recognize it diplomatically, which they won't do. And they've said, no way is this happening unless the Palestinians get their own sovereignty, and we are not for a moment entertaining any prospect of them being removed from their land. Noticeably quite strong words in support of the two-state solution from Germany and from the UK. The biggest supporters after the US of Israel's genocide. So the whole world seems to have united. And I can see that a lot of that is because so many countries would be opposed to that happening anyway. But I also think there are certain players that are already prepared to stand up and say, in a veiled manner, we have noticed that the head of the United States, the President of the United States, is not a trustworthy character. but because it's his fantasy is so that both of those things overlap. The first thing is, how are you going to get the entire population of Gaza to leave when they've endured 15 months of genocide, when their armed resistance has carried on fighting back quite successfully, actually, against the Israelis. None of those circumstances on the ground have changed. You would have to go in militarily to make the people of Gaza leave their homes. And you're going to replay the last 50... it's not going to work. And then the notion that, there's suddenly, miraculously, this depopulated Gaza Strip that Trump's developer friends can make into a Riviera. Well, that's a fantasy, because you aren't going to have a depopulated Gaza Strip. So the only way that you would do it would be that the US replaces Israel in being the military force that goes into Gaza and that one way or another tries to break the resistance. And it's like, well, that's not going to work either. And Republicans, and I noticed in particular Lindsey Graham recognized this, very quickly thought through the logical failures in Trump's way of thinking and recognized that this sounds like Vietnam.
He's the kind of man who was at Trump's side, the woman at Trump's side, who said, excuse me, sir, have you considered this? These people who were the checks and balances, who were no longer particularly around, nor, she said yesterday, is Congress.
Congress is being deliberately excluded at the moment. What are we? Over 2 weeks in. Blizzard of executive orders. And he appears to have paid absolutely no attention to Congress yet about the relationship between the executive branch and Congress, that he can propose all kinds of things, but he then needs to work with Congress for them to be implemented, for them to pass the laws that are necessary for things to take place, and also to approve the money that is required for these things to take place. And at the moment, don't see any of that happening.
We're talking, I suppose, as with Musk, about a distinctly dodgy hybridization of private capital and personal interest, which some people would describe as creaming off, others would say is, creative enterprise or something. that kind of merges with the political ethos of the time. I mean, America is fundamentally a corporation, isn't it? I mean, individuals can be treated legally as corporations as well, and have far more enhanced human rights than perhaps we do under those terms.
Well, I mean, I think what, obviously corporations have massive power. I mean, corporations have massive power everywhere. That that's one of the difficulties of that's happened during our lifetimes, is that they have become more powerful than our national bodies, and I don't really think that that's been very helpful. But I don't think that it's wise on any basis to have a new administration that seems to regard the lawmaking, budget-setting component of the United States government as something that is either disposable or in many ways, actually the kind of enemy within. I mean, surely this is where Trump's going to come unstuck in some ways, because he, treating all federal employees as though they're the enemy within, which I think, if we get down to it, is what's happening.
They're the grown-ups, I suppose, arguably.
And then obviously, the judiciary is also then regarded with suspicion. And Trump's plan, which doesn't seem very workable, is to replace everyone that he regards as suspicious with people who, will swear absolute allegiance to him and whatever drivel he comes up with.
As was said in the bidding, apparently, in his inauguration. Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah. So part of that is worrying because that's what Hitler did, and then part of it, you think the scale of this is too huge for the checks and balances within the United States system of the executive, Congress and the judiciary, for him to be able to sweep both the Congress and judiciary aside and end up as the kind of dictator that he wants to be. But I mean, who knows? It's pretty troubling, the scale of everything at the moment.
Basically what you're alluding to is the fact that somebody has to make these things work, however screwball they are. I remember as a part-time tubist of my acquaintance worked in the Cabinet Office in the latter Blair Brown years, when they were the handover. And he said, well, the legislation was coming through at such a rate that we could not find the time to make it coherent. And a lot of bad law was passed.
Right.
He's specifically, I think, referring to PFI and things like that, or some of the niceties behind them. And things were moving so quickly, perhaps at the behest of these corporate interests, that there was no underpinning coherence or no proper oversight.
Right.
There wasn't time for it. And I'm wondering if this seems to be the sort of thing that occasionally in political life is engineered, to create the excitement of the moment and the moral imperative of creative destruction.
Well, I don't know whether everyone noticed or remembered, but there was Brexit went through a whole load of phases in this country. But I think it reached a particularly disturbing point when the people who were in power, and Rees-Mogg was one of them, were envisioning the whole of the United Kingdom as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. That what Brexit had done was it wiped everything clean. They, and they alone, felt that they were empowered to rebuild a Britain with whatever took their fancy, and that there was no way of that being challenged. And the particular crunch point that it reached was that there were thousands and thousands of laws covering all kinds of aspects of employment and the environment, so many of them that they were almost impossible to count. And Rees-Mogg in particular was in this position of trying to enforce the end of all these laws on an arbitrary date, and that then ministers, without consulting Parliament, would then be empowered come up with replacements and do whatever they wanted.
Really. Streamline.
When it was seen off, but had it not been seen off, not only would it have destroyed so many of the safeguards that we require, but it would have been politically so chaotic that huge parts of the economy, I think, would have collapsed. And I think that's what we're looking at with Trump, is that taking a hammer to everything may please your ideological base, but actually you're smashing into bits quite a complicated system that sustains hugely important aspects of the economy, as well as everything that I see them doing is that they're trying to make as many Americans unemployed as possible, and that's not politically helpful. They're going to notice.
It's curious, isn't it? What will they do? Form vigilante armies or something? I mean, it's not, because there's a whole part of America that's off camera, that's non-optic, isn't it? People in trailer parks off the freeways. And a friend of mine back in the day did a tour of these places at some cost to his personal safety. But there's I presume the skill of the far right is to mobilise these people without them feeling there is an end point. It is simply that their anger will operate in a sort of quasi-religious way.
Yeah, there are many different contexts to it, aren't there? So a religious component, a racist component, an anti-woke component. You're absolutely right to say to point out how big America is, and how you can't see the United States like Britain, which is small enough for you to know that if you went from Cornwall to the north of Scotland, you would recognise so many identifying factors that are the same. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
But I wonder how long you can cater to people's prejudices without delivering anything in terms of economic improvement before the dream fades.
As you were saying with Starmer in a different dimension earlier on.
I mean, all people want is for a slightly more secure standard of living, and they won't deliver that, because delivering that means taking something from people who've got too much and giving it to people who haven't got enough, and that redistributive aspect has been erased by both major parties in most countries.
Even the idea of the trickle down, because in the sense that people are elected because out of moral superiority, de facto wealth.
They've kind of stopped talking about it, haven't they? I mean, it's more like it's more like, without them wanting to admit it openly, everything is a trickle up or a flood up. But I mean, it is genuinely, Andy, from the poor to the rich.
Yes.
I mean, all we're seeing is a permanent impoverishment of more and more and more people as the rich get rich beyond anything that anyone in living memory has ever seen. I mean, I remember a few years ago reading about how the levels of equality were at Edwardian levels, the first decade of the 20th century, when equality was, massively extreme. But we seem to be back in some kind of medieval land now.
It's odd. I mean, people think. I mean, my parents thought back to their parents of the Edwardian period, who were both born in the 20s. Both the grandkids in the sky now. It's a period of national optimism. Okay, the map was coloured pink. There were atrocities that people didn't know about or weren't able to conceive of. But at the same time, there was this feeling that we'd stood for something. In the equivalent, I suppose, now, in a sort of end of the pier, say of the century sense, that Trump is angling for with his MAGA hats.
Yeah, well, I think the problem with the rosy picture of the past is that yes, we did have money, but that was because of our exploitation of the rest of the world.
Quite.
So the wealth of our countries, some of which did genuinely trickle down to the people. In fact, more than trickle down in terms of that period from the end of the 19th century up until Thatcher, where there were genuinely socialist elements of
bits of
politics,
philanthropy,
not just in the Labour Party but in the Conservative Party. But surely what we've seen since the 70s is the steady erosion of that. So that in real terms, working people are just getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And, you know, we're meant to be distracted by whatever it is that they can put in front of us that is meant to make us not notice. But well, actually...
The orangery itself is a sideshow in a sense, isn't
it? Yeah. But I mean, that's not really going away, is it? You know, so the America you're talking about is one where materially, very obviously, you will see a decline in the standard of living of so many Americans over the last 50 years. And I think the same thing could be said about Britain. And they're constantly papering over it because they don't want that to be noticed. Yeah. But if you look at what's happening with the people are not happy. They are being led a merry dance by people on the far right who come up with all kinds of reasons for suggesting that they're a solution. But when the far right gets power, they provide no solutions because you know their use of racial hatred, of anti-wokeness, of all of this stuff is not something that they're going to constructively turn into policy that improves the lives of people, because actually they're still as invested in the big money world. Yeah. And not people. So no one's looking after the people. So, you know, it would be very helpful if people recognise this about Trump over the during his term, that he's failing to deliver, because I think he is going to fail to deliver. Yeah. I think all it looks like he's going to do is impoverish people even further.
Yeah. Having made a bit of money in the process.
Well, he's always out for making money. I mean, surely in some ways the Gaza speech was just like he was inviting bids, wasn't he?
I seem to remember Boris saying something, you know, as ever there was a mic on when he didn't think it was on, about Gaddafi, and saying, well, you know, when all the bodies are cleared away, we can put some nice shopping precincts up on it. So there is a playbook there, isn't there? I mean, again, there's sort of, you know, apparent moral bypass. But do you, with that in mind, given the fact that there was one headline, I suspect it was GB News, but whatever, saying that Farage, I paraphrase, makes overture to Boris for a mega sort of neo-Tory reform thing. Will we have to go through this before we achieve a level of grown-upness, as America has done? Do you see a cycle here that has to play itself out?
Well, America hasn't done it, has it? Because America, you know, Biden failed to convince enough American people that he was the grown-up alternative after 4 years of Trump. I mean, you know,
yes.
For a variety of reasons, you know, and there were two elements of that story that don't involve the failure of neoliberalism. One is that he was quite patently mentally falling apart and incapable of leadership. And the second one, which is, you know, very crucial, is his absolutely unquestioning and dedicated support for Israel's genocide, putting Israel before the interests of the United States. But I don't think he was able to sell a message to enough of the American people that having the Democrats in charge means that they will look after your interests, because they have the same neoliberal problems that we're now seeing with Keir Starmer. You know, so America then went back to Trump as though his first 4 years didn't count, and that, you know, maybe this time it will be better. It's possible, it seems, unfortunately possible, that that's the way we're going to go in the UK, is that having got rid of the far right, and when they lost last July, the Tories lost because they had lost the support of the people. I mean, they hemorrhaged support on election day, and that's why Labour won. Labour didn't really win, the Tories lost. Yeah. To imagine that we're now going to have a resurgence of far-right politics in this country that would be even more far-right than the Tories were, because, you know, Brexit wasn't Brexity enough. I mean, this is derangement, Andy, but this is derangement on a number of fronts that I don't know how we're going to challenge. There's Roger Hallam in his prison cell talking sense like almost nobody in the mainstream media about the threats that we face, while at the same time a whole bunch of angry people are obsessed with the fact that they should be able to drive their cars as much as they want, and that climate change is a lie, and and add in immigration and add in anti-wokeness, and it's a toxic stew of horror that is entirely inappropriate for the times that we're living in. But I don't know how we stop it. I mean, if we're looking at British politics, there are enough people who vote for other parties to offset any possible Tory reform collaboration. I think it's still pretty evenly matched, as it is in the States. That we have three components of our political lives: the centre-left, the right, and the people who don't vote. And we're all struggling with how to manage that. The system as it works, as it currently is, just doesn't work. That's why we end up appealing to not the whole of the right, but a part of the right that is the most extreme, whose opinions are valued above and beyond those of everybody else, and that's what's driven Trump. That's what was driving the Tories in their last horrendous years in office, and that Farage is somehow miraculously managing to resuscitate as a viable way forward. And I do think, just briefly to mention, Andy, the media has a huge part to play in this. I saw a post yesterday of somebody saying, look, these guys have a few percent of council seats and a few percent of seats in Parliament. Why are they being given so much coverage? It's actually just promoting them. And the Green Party has always and rightly complained they don't get the coverage. They've got way more support than they ever had, and yet they're constantly sidelined and still really treated as cranks. Whereas openly would-be fascists apparently given platforms left, right, and centre.
Yeah. Presumably, it's about the optics. Is it? I mean, the people. We've talked about Linton Crosby off mic earlier on. The fact that people can construct narratives that appeal to lazy client journalists and provide a relatively simplistic picture of what's going on.
Yeah.
And incorporate an element of demonisation, as you say, that is subtle, but can be traced back.
Well, negativity sells, doesn't it, in every way? I mean, it sells in clicks, so it sells in terms of the money that people can raise, but it's a terrible way forward for humanity. And we're in a much darker place than we were 10 years ago.
Do you think voting should be compulsory, as it is, say, in Australia?
I don't know how you would make voting compulsory in a country like the UK. You'd end up is having to arrest millions of people who would absolutely demand their right to refuse to vote in a corrupt and broken system. Yeah.
So the argument there is in the form, I suppose, of a benign anarchy. In terms of humanitarian organisation, which I know we talk about from time to time.
Yeah.
I see it happening all around us.
There's
a metaphorical sunflower here in SE4.
Well, which again ties in with what the environmentalists want, which is that they want people's assemblies to be responsible for making the decisions that are then implemented by the people who hold the purse strings. And it's a grown-up way of thinking about our participation in our communities, rather than this very distant world we live in, where once every 5 years we elect a bunch of liars to not do what they said they were going to do, because they only said it so they could get into power. Where we're all kind of dispossessed of power all the time. But there is another answer, which would be proportional representation, because if you introduced a fair proportional representation system, you could actually go to people's doorsteps and say, no, your vote does count. Because every time 25,000 people get together and vote for a person or a party, they get a representative in Parliament. Whereas, as it currently stands with first past the post, an astonishingly high percentage of our votes are just wasted. They're just wasted. People come in second, and it's like, it doesn't matter how many votes they got. It's all in the bin. Everything is in the bin. I live in Lewisham. I don't vote. Why would I vote? There's no point. Labour has an unassailable majority. So I register a protest vote, Andy. I vote Green. All around the country, more people did that in the last election than have ever done it before. But in a proportional representation system, suddenly the Greens would have 50 seats and would be a major player in a grown-up coalition parliament where people had to actually get together and discuss things, rather than what we have, which is that every 5 years or whenever the parties change, whoever comes in generally just sets fire to everything that happened before and comes up with a new plan.
Yeah, Black Rocks of this world are doing very nicely.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, while I was saying about those changes, I realised that it didn't apply in this current situation because the Labour government has done almost nothing to distinguish itself from the party that was so ruinously in power for the previous 14 years. They don't even have the ambition to burn everything down and say, no, look at us, we're different. They're actually just saying, no, look at us, we're the same.
Oh dear. So, I mean, looking around, I suppose, for shards of optimism, you are innately a communitarian. Roger Hallam's in jail. You go off campaigning. Do you sense that when you meet people in terms of protest, that they are there's an energy there, there's a demoralisation, there's a dogged determination in the midst of the Stygian English winter? Is it a mixture of all those things?
I think it's been very difficult so far. It was a very cold January, and people are always poor in January.
Yeah.
And more people are poorer than they have been, in recent memory. I suspect. I think that's just a situation that's getting worse because the cost of living isn't going down; it's going up. And if you think of the vast numbers of people who really don't have a lot of money to play with, it's getting harder and harder. If we look on the environmental front, it's brilliant that Roger's in prison pretending that he isn't and speaking to the world and saying, our minds must be free. You are out there. You can help to create what we need. But it's very difficult to be living in a country where with the most severe environmental protest legislation punishing people of anywhere in the world. That's a difficult thing to overcome. Like I said earlier, when you step off the curb and put your foot on the road and can be immediately arrested and will then be put on trial, quite possibly in front of a right-wing climate change denying judge who will imprison you, then we're in a very dangerous position. Because you have to be able to protest. And you have to be able to protest in the sense that you think that something is possible as a result of it. And that means you have to be able to make the authorities and the status quo uncomfortable. I'm not saying that we all make our distinctions between what's acceptable in terms of non-violent protest and how far you push things. But you have to be able to make people feel uncomfortable. You have to be able to engage in something that is disruptive in some sense. Otherwise, you're in the position that the Tories have put us in and that Labour has supported, which is that we have almost no way of voicing our dissent. And that's just a few steps away from the kind of authoritarianism that is extremely dangerous, because it means we don't have the freedom to dissent anymore, practically.
I suppose you could argue that effectively you've got a sort of passive-aggressive civil disorder in terms of the fact the cost of living has been allowed, assuming you take a Keynesian line on this, to escalate to the extent where people are going to be shoplifting or are going to be expressing themselves or get themselves in situations where they have to break the law in order to just get enough bread on the table.
Yeah. And there's also, I think, there's an element of Britain. I mean, it's funny. Years ago, I was given a book to review, which was a reissuing of a book about the King mob riots at the end of the 18th century, which were actually Unfortunately, like a number of British riots were fantastically anti-papist.
Yeah.
But it was a riot that consumed huge parts of London and led to violence. And actually, throughout London's history, the people have erupted in violence, over and over and over again. And we live in very, very quiet times now.
Yeah.
But there is a part of the British psyche, it seems to me, that can erupt into rioting.
Southport, just a couple of months ago.
Well, yeah, exactly. So exactly what happened last summer, where that was not just motivated by truly objectionable far-right racist people. They were absolutely there, but some of that was just people expressing their frustration. I say, what's happening, son? It's like, I feel really, I'm skint, I'm feeling really miserable, there's no future, I'm going to set fire to things. Yeah. We saw it in 2011, it was the same thing. Yeah. There is an outbreak of violence that we can trace throughout our history when people are feeling particularly, downtrodden and put upon, and the conditions are right for it, Andy.
Yeah.
The problem with all of that is that it's not politically constructive, and what's made things so much worse now than I can see throughout my history in this country as someone who's in my early 60s is the influence of the far right, which wasn't there. I mean, disruption, so much disruption that I look back on that took place in my life was from the left. Was people politically trying to make a point about the necessity for political change. To have the presence of so much far-right aggravation is, it's just dispiriting. I find it genuinely dispiriting. But how do we address that problem? There's so much misinformation, isn't there? And a kind of it seems so difficult to diffuse these kinds of hatreds, and I suppose part of that is the social media world we live in. People are in bubbles, and they are reinforcing their prejudices within these bubbles, and all of that, in so many ways, is when you examine it, it's like, oh my God, this is there is such violent intent and hatred going on here. For people who are not being directly threatened, this is something they've invented it.
Yes. We were talking a couple of sessions ago about the fact that people are moving around London, may not know their neighbourhoods very well. I think we were thinking about independent venues, weren't we, if I remember rightly?
Right,
and that sort of, as it were, takes me back to the idea of localities and linked localities, and the fact that traditionally, in the Bernard Miles phrase, London is a city of villages, and it's how it developed, really. It's how cities develop. Whereas in my friend in Chicago, I mentioned yesterday, the tendency there is to think of the city as a monolith, with mono-government and wastage and overspend, and all the tropes that the right wing tend to bring in. But again, it seems pretty intractable, whereas here, a lot of things get done in a communitarian way, don't they?
Yeah, I think those things definitely do still happen, and and that's always been a good thing, surely. But I think we may have spoken about, London, for example, is made up of 32 boroughs, and the City of London, with its own extraordinary lawlessness at the heart of it. But if you were to look at political breakdown, then the model is not of Sadiq Khan and the GLA and a huge unassailable fortress governing the whole of London. It's actually that on the ground, each of us, many of the decisions that are taken about our lives are by our local borough, which generally, each borough is generally, in terms of population, the size of what would be a city everywhere else.
Yes.
In a way, London, therefore, is like 32 cities in one. The population of Lewisham is getting on for 300,000 people.
That is a heavy thought. When did I last look at that, Andy? Thanks for mentioning that.
I mean, Lewisham has has one of the highest birth rates and the youngest populations in London, but it is huge, and and for a variety of reasons involving corruption and dysfunction from central government and local government, we're not really run very well by most of the people who represent us. So I still don't know what that means, but I think when you build from a local model that, if people work to improve their neighbourhood, that's a very obvious and direct thing that people can do. But the ripples from that spread out to the area that you live in, which, and anything you do will bring you into contact with the fact that the borough you live in has a council that runs it. So it really does feel as though bringing accountability and reform to councils would be a helpful way forward.
Yeah. As Gandhi once said, democracy in America, wasn't it? Could be a very good idea. Andy, thank you very much. Great to catch up. Cheers.